I've always believed that history isn't just about dates and names in a textbook. It's about choices, power, and the ways ordinary people's lives are shaped by things they often can't see. Some of those stories are tragic, some are shocking, but all of them leave behind a shadow. Today we're going to talk about something that seems harmless, even sweet, but has a much darker story than most of us realize. Sugar. For centuries, it's been more than just an ingredient in desserts. It's been the fuel for empires, the reason for wars, the foundation of slavery, and even a tool of manipulation in modern science and politics. And yet, despite everything, we can't seem to live without it. This isn't just the story of sugar, it's the story of power of addiction and of how something so small can quietly rule the world. Chapter 1. Sweet Lies. Bitter Truth. You know, I always thought of sugar as this innocent little pleasure in life, something we sprinkle on our coffee stir into tea or sneak from the Halloween stash when no one's looking. I mean, who doesn't love candy, right? It feels harmless, even childlike. But then I stumbled on a fact that stopped me cold. The average American eats over 60 pounds of added sugar every year. 60 pounds. That's about the weight of a 9-year-old child, but instead of carrying that child, you're consuming it. Spoonful by spoonful, soda by soda, slice by slice. And when I first heard that, I couldn't help but ask myself, what are we really putting into our bodies and why? It's funny how sugar is everywhere. It's in our bread, our sauces, our drinks. Sometimes it's so hidden that we don't even realize how much of it we're swallowing. And yet, for all its sweetness, the history of sugar is anything but sweet. In fact, it's bitter violent and so deeply entangled with power and money that it makes you rethink every candy bar you've ever unwrapped. And here's where it gets darker. I'd always heard people joke that sugar is more addictive than cocaine, but I brushed it off. I thought there's no way that could be true. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized that this wasn't just a silly comparison. There are actual studies, real data showing that sugar can hijack the brain's reward system in ways that are disturbingly similar to drugs. And the craziest part, unlike cocaine, sugar isn't hiding in the shadows. It's sitting right in your pantry, waiting on every grocery store shelf, and marketed directly to kids. So when I decided to explore this story, I thought I'd just be learning about where sugar comes from or why we crave it so much. But what I found was a history soaked in exploitation and greed, a trail of blood and suffering behind every spoonful. Entire empires were built on sugar. Millions of people were enslaved because of it. Wars were fought, families were torn apart, and governments quietly made deals that allowed this industry to thrive, while we, the consumers, were left in the dark. And that's why I want to take you on this journey with me. Because sugar isn't just a sweet treat. It's a mirror into human history, into our addictions, our greed, and the dangerous ways corporations can control what we eat and what we believe. So, as much as I love a good piece of chocolate, I can't look at sugar the same way anymore. By the end of this story, I don't think you will either. Chapter 2. The First Sweet Taste. When I think about sugar, it feels so modern, like something tied to candy bars, soda cans, and colorful cereal boxes. But the truth is, sugar has been with humanity for thousands of years. Long before we packaged it into neat little cubes, people were already chasing that sweet taste. The earliest traces of sugarcane go all the way back to the indigenous people of New Guinea. Imagine it, prehistoric humans literally chewing on the stalks of this plant just to get that hint of sweetness. There was no processing, no refining, just raw sugarcane gnawed on like a carrot. It wasn't just a craving, it was discovery. For those people, sweetness was rare, and finding it in nature must have felt like uncovering treasure. From there, sugarcane began to travel. By around 800 BC, it had spread across Asia, and by the 1st century, India became the beating heart of sugar's story. It was in India that people learned how to transform sugarcane into something more refined, something closer to what we recognize today. They built early mills, boiling and crystallizing the juice into lumps and syrups. No longer did you have to gnaw on a stalk, you could dissolve sugar into drinks, sprinkle it on food, even make the world's very first hard candies. They called it kanda. And if that sounds familiar, it's where the word candy comes from. But sugar wasn't only about pleasure. In those early centuries, it was considered medicine. People believed sugar could soothe the stomach, cleanse the kidneys, even push toxins out of the body. To them, it wasn't just something tasty, it was healing, and in a way that made it even more powerful. Eventually, word of sugar spread beyond India. The Greeks and the Romans encountered it, and their reaction reads almost like love poetry. There's this one description calling sugar a reed in India that brings forth honey without the help of bees. Can you imagine tasting sugar for the very first time when your world has only ever known honey as sweetness? It must have felt magical, almost otherworldly. Still, for centuries, sugar wasn't a daily treat. It wasn't sprinkled in coffee or baked into cakes. It was medicine. It was luxury. It was something rare reserved for the elite. If you were sick, maybe a doctor would mix you a syrup. If you were wealthy, you might enjoy sugar as a delicacy after a meal. But for most of humanity, sugar remained just out of reach. And that's the thing about sugar's story. It has always been tied to exclusivity, to status, to who gets access and who doesn't. Even in these early days, sugar was shaping society in ways we didn't yet understand. What started as people in New Guinea chewing on a plant had within a few centuries turned into a substance powerful enough to be called medicine, to be hoarded by elites, and to spark trade across continents. And this was only the beginning, because once sugar reached the hands of kings, queens, and empires, its story stopped being sweet. It became something far darker. Chapter 3: White Gold for the Elite. By the time sugar made its way into Europe, it wasn't just food anymore, it was treasure. People called it white gold. And honestly, that name says everything. Sugar wasn't sitting in kitchen cupboards the way it does now. It was locked away, guarded like jewels, only accessible to the wealthiest families. If you were rich enough to have sugar on your table, it was more than a sweet treat, it was a statement. It told everyone who walked into your home, I have money, I have power, and I can afford this luxury that you can't. In London, sugar sold for the modern equivalent of $50 a pound. Imagine paying $50 for a single pound of sugar. Who could afford that? Not the everyday person. It was kings, queens, noblemen, and merchants. For them, sugar wasn't just to eat, it was to show off. Take King Henry VIII, for example. He didn't just love sugar, he turned it into art. He had his personal confectioners build sugar sculptures of his castle's cannons, even entire battle scenes. Guests would come to his banquets, see these massive displays, and then watch them get eaten. It was power made edible. And when his daughter, Queen Elizabeth Diamond, came to power, she carried that same obsession. Elizabeth's love for sugar was so extreme that it literally ruined her health. Historical records say her teeth began to rot and turn black. But instead of seeing that as a problem, people saw it as fashionable. The Queen's black teeth became a status symbol. The wealthy began blackening their own teeth just to look like her. Can you imagine deliberately making your teeth look rotten just to show you could afford sugar? Archaeologists have even found evidence of this. They've studied skeletons from 16th and 17th century nobles, buried in expensive coffins dressed in fine clothes, but with mouths full of decayed teeth. To me, that says everything sugar was reshaping not just diets, but identities. And it wasn't just about health or taste. Sugar became part of elite entertainment. At royal feasts, sugar was molded into elaborate marzipan statues, grand displays of saints' churches, even political figures meant to impress guests and flaunt wealth. Picture it: entire cathedrals sculpted out of sugar, only to be destroyed and eaten at the end of the night. But here's the catch. While the elites were gorging themselves on these sugar spectacles, the rest of society could barely get a taste. For the poor, sugar was unattainable. And yet the desire for it spread like wildfire. Everyone wanted it. Everyone dreamed of having even a spoonful of what the kings and queens enjoyed daily. This is where sugar's story starts to shift. Because when demand skyrockets, people with power don't stop to ask, how do we get more of this safely? They ask, how do we get more of this cheaply? And that question would open the door to one of the darkest chapters in human history. What began as a symbol of wealth and status would soon become the reason millions of lives were enslaved, displaced, and destroyed. Sugar wasn't just sweet anymore, it was dangerous. Chapter 4. The Bitter Price of Sweetness. By the late 1400s, Europe's appetite for sugar was out of control. The wealthy couldn't get enough of it, and merchants saw an opportunity they couldn't resist. But there was one problem: sugarcane doesn't grow well in Europe. It needs heat, humidity, and endless labor. And so the hunt for new lands and new workers began. Christopher Columbus, on his second voyage across the Atlantic, carried sugarcane with him. He planted it in the Caribbean in places like modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The climate was perfect. The soil was fertile. Sugar could grow there in abundance. To Europeans, this was the jackpot. But here's the dark truth: none of it could happen without people to work the fields. And the work wasn't just hard, it was brutal. Cutting down 10-foot-high stalks of sugarcane under a blazing sun, carrying the heavy bundles, then grinding, boiling, and refining them into crystals. It was endless, back-breaking labor that no one would ever choose to do. So colonizers forced it. First, they enslaved the indigenous people of the Caribbean. But disease, violence, and exhaustion wiped out entire populations within decades. When the local labor force was gone, Europeans turned their eyes elsewhere to Africa. This was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, and sugar was at the very heart of it. Entire African villages were raided. Families were torn apart. Men, women, and children were chained, forced onto ships, and packed below deck so tightly they could barely move. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, lasted around 80 days. Many never survived it. Disease, starvation, and abuse claimed countless lives before the ships even reached the New World. But for those who did survive, what awaited them was almost worse. On the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil, enslaved people were worked from sunrise to long after dark, often with little food, no medical care, and constant threats of violence. Plantation owners measured their lives not in decades, but in years. The average enslaved worker survived only 7 to 9 years after arriving. 7 years, that was the value of a human life in the eyes of sugar barons. And all of this was happening because Europe wanted more sugar. By the 1600s and 1700s, the demand was so great that over 12 million Africans were trafficked across the ocean to feed it. 12 million lives uprooted, exploited, and lost, all for something we now toss into our coffee without a second thought. This is the part of sugar's history that still shocks me the most. It wasn't just about taste or luxury anymore. It was about greed on a massive scale. Sugar turned into an engine that fueled colonization, slavery, and unimaginable suffering. And while millions were dying in fields and ships, the wealthy back in Europe were showing off sugar sculptures at dinner parties, laughing and sipping tea, sweetened with the very product that cost so many lives. That contrast between indulgence and horror is what makes sugar's history so bitter. By the 19th century, sugar plantations dominated entire economies. In some regions, 90% of enslaved people were forced to work in sugar production. And the more the world consumed, the deeper the cycle of violence became. When I think about this, I can't help but picture every grain of sugar as carrying a story, not of sweetness but of pain. Behind every spoonful was someone's labor, someone's suffering, someone's stolen life. And this was only the beginning. Because once sugar became embedded in global trade, it didn't just shape diets, it shaped politics, industry, and the rise of empires. It wasn't just food anymore. It was power. Chapter 5, From Royal Tables to Every Home. After centuries of being locked away in the palaces of Europe, sugar eventually broke free and spilled onto the tables of ordinary people. But it didn't happen overnight. For the longest time, sugar was still rare and expensive. Most people could only dream of tasting the sweets that kings and queens flaunted. Then came the rise of something new: the sugar beet. During the American Civil War, when northern states were cut off from imported sugar, abolitionists promoted beet sugar as free sugar. It didn't rely on enslaved labor in the Caribbean, and it could be grown closer to home. That one shift began to change everything. Suddenly, sugar wasn't just for the elite anymore. It started creeping into the diets of middle-class families. By the early 1800s, the average person was consuming around 30 pounds of sugar a year. That might not sound like much compared to today, but back then it was a dramatic change. People were putting sugar in jams, preserves, and baked goods. It was no longer about sculptures on banquet tables. It was about making everyday food last longer and taste better. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, the real sugar explosion. Machines made refining faster, cheaper, and more efficient. Mass production turned sugar into an ordinary household staple. It was no longer a luxury. It was becoming a necessity. In America, sugar's rise was tied to cultural shifts, too. Think about Prohibition in the 1920s when alcohol was banned. People couldn't get their buzz from beer or spirits anymore, so they turned to the next best thing, soda and ice cream. Soda fountains popped up everywhere, offering fizzy drinks and ice cream floats loaded with sugar. Those became the social hubs of the time. If bars were closing, soda fountains were opening, and America was quickly developing a sweet tooth it would never shake off. But sugar's story has always had a darker side, even when it seemed innocent. During World War II, sugar was the very first food to be rationed in the United States. Each person was limited to just 8 ounces a week. People found substitutes, molasses, corn syrup, even honey, but the cravings never went away. And after the war, when sugar was back on the shelves, consumption skyrocketed again. It was around this time that companies made a discovery that would change our diets. Forever corn syrup was cheaper than sugar. It blended easily into almost anything, and nobody questioned it. So while people thought they were eating real sugar, what they were really consuming was a cheaper substitute one that would quietly take over the food industry. By the mid-1900s, sugar was no longer a symbol of wealth. It was a part of everyday life woven into breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The average American was consuming over 40 pounds of sugar a year, and the numbers kept climbing. What had once been a status symbol had now become a silent addiction for an entire society. Looking back, it's striking how fast it all happened. In just a few generations, sugar went from royal banquets and blackened teeth of queens to the lunchboxes of school children and the aisles of every grocery store. The sweetness that was once rare and celebrated had become ordinary, expected, so common that we stopped asking where it came from or what it was doing to us. And that's exactly how the sugar industry wanted it. Chapter 6: Big Sugar's Dirty Secrets. By the 1960s, sugar was everywhere. Breakfast cereals, sodas, baked goods, you name it. People were eating more sugar than ever before. But then something unsettling started to show up in medical data: heart disease. It was becoming the leading cause of death among American men, and researchers were scrambling to figure out why. At first, some studies pointed directly at sugar. Too much sugar seemed to mess with cholesterol levels, blood pressure, and overall heart health. The evidence was there, and it was building. But just as quickly as those results appeared, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, sugar wasn't the villain anymore. Fat was. Saturated fat became the public enemy, and sugar slipped quietly into the background. And that wasn't an accident. In 1967, a group called the Sugar Research Foundation, funded by the sugar industry itself, paid scientists at Harvard a modern equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars to write studies that blamed fat instead of sugar. Those scientists published papers saying fat was the real danger, while sugar was just fine. The result: an entire generation grew up terrified of fat, buying low-fat products that were actually loaded with sugar. It's wild to think about. The food we trusted, the science we trusted, it was all being shaped by people whose only goal was to sell more sugar. And they were good at it. Very good. Coca-Cola and other big companies joined in pouring millions into campaigns that downplayed any link between sugary drinks and obesity. Some of the ads from that era are almost laughable now. They claimed sugar gave you energy to exercise, that it could actually help you lose weight. One ad even promised that drinking a sugary soda before a workout would save calories later. Imagine that, being told that the more sugar you ate, the thinner you'd be. But people believed it. And why wouldn't they? The ads were slick, the science looked legitimate, and doctors weren't pushing back because the research they read had been carefully edited by industry money. Meanwhile, soda sales exploded. From the 1970s onward, consumption of sugar-filled drinks jumped by over 100%. Every can of Coke, every glass of sweetened tea, Every brightly colored juice box was fueling not just profits, but an epidemic. Obesity and diabetes rates began climbing in step with sugar sales, and yet the message from the industry stayed the same. Don't worry about sugar. Worry about fat. Looking back, it's hard not to feel a little betrayed. This wasn't just clever marketing, it was manipulation on a massive scale. Entire diets, public health guidelines, even government recommendations were influenced by Big Sugar's money. The truth about sugar's role in heart disease and obesity was buried while companies kept cashing in. And that's the part that sticks with me. We like to believe science is objective, that facts are facts. But when money gets involved, especially billions of dollars, facts can be twisted, reshaped, and sold back to us in shiny packaging. By the end of the 20th century, sugar wasn't just an ingredient, it was a weapon. It shaped what we ate, what we believed, and ultimately how healthy or unhealthy we became. And the scariest part? Most of us had no idea. Chapter 7: Sweeter Than Cocaine. I used to roll my eyes whenever someone said sugar was as addictive as cocaine. It just sounded dramatic. I mean, we're talking about cookies and candy, not a street drug that ruins lives. But then I came across a study that completely flipped the way I thought about it. In 2007, a group of French scientists did an experiment with lab rats. They gave the rats a choice between two drinks. One was sugar water, the other was water laced with cocaine. And here's what happened: 94% of the rats chose the sugar water. 94%. Even when researchers increased the dose of cocaine, the rats still went for the sugar. That was the moment I realized the comparison wasn't just a catchy headline. There was science behind it. The rats weren't just choosing a sweet drink, they were showing signs of addiction. They binged on the sugar water when it was available. When it was taken away, they showed withdrawal, anxiety, depression, restlessness, cravings. It was textbook addiction behavior, only this time the drug wasn't cocaine. It was sugar. And here's the kicker. Our brains work in a similar way. Whenever we eat sugar, our brain releases dopamine, the feel-good chemical. It's the same chemical that fires when people take drugs, drink alcohol, or even gamble. That little rush of pleasure reinforces the behavior, making us want to do it again, and again, and again. When I think about that, it makes sense why sugar is everywhere in our lives. It's not just because it tastes good, it's because we're wired to want more of it. Our ancestors needed quick energy to survive, and sweet foods were rare. So our brains evolved to reward us for eating them. But now sugar isn't rare anymore. It's in almost everything from bread to ketchup to pasta sauce. That survival mechanism has turned into a trap, and it doesn't stop there. Studies have shown that sugar addiction can even be linked to alcoholism. The same dopamine pathways are involved, and people who crave sweets may also be more vulnerable to alcohol abuse. In some cases, these tendencies can even be passed down genetically. Think about that addiction to sugar running through families, shaping generations, without anyone realizing it. In the United States, the numbers are staggering. The American Heart Association recommends 6 to 9 teaspoons of sugar a day, but the average American consumes 17. That adds up to more than 60 pounds of added sugar a year. 60 pounds. That's not just a little treat here and there, that's a lifestyle one that most of us don't even recognize we're caught in. So when people say sugar is addictive, they're not exaggerating. The science is clear: sugar lights up the brain in ways that are frighteningly similar to hard drugs. And unlike cocaine, you don't have to sneak around to get it. It's legal, cheap, and sitting in plain sight on every supermarket shelf. The more I think about it, the more I realize we're all just a little like those lab rats. Given the choice, most of us keep going back to the sugar water. Chapter 8: The Sugar Dynasty. By now, you'd think the story of sugar would have slowed down. We know it's addictive, we know it's dangerous, we know it's hiding in almost everything we eat. But the truth is, sugar didn't just shape our health, it shaped power. And the family at the center of it all is one you've probably never even heard of. The Fanjul family. If you buy Domino sugar in the yellow box C&H in the pink and white bag, or Florida Crystals in the green packaging, chances are you've been buying from them. This one family controls massive chunks of America's sugar supply, and they've been in the sugar business for over 150 years. Their story starts in Cuba. Before Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959, the Fanjuls were already rich, owning real estate distilleries and sugar mills. When Castro came to power, they lost much of it and moved their operations to Florida. But instead of fading into the background, they doubled down. They bought up thousands of acres of land sugar mills in Louisiana and built refineries. By the 1980s, they weren't just successful, they were powerful. The Fanjuls weren't interested in being another sugar company. They wanted to dominate the entire industry, and they figured out exactly how to do it by making friends in the right places. The family became infamous for political donations. And here's the strange part. They didn't choose sides. They gave millions to both Republicans and Democrats. Presidents from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush all had connections to the Fanjuls. A lobbyist once said, "The sugar guys win votes because they're better at politics than anyone else." And honestly, he wasn't wrong. But here's the darker part of their empire. While the family collected billions, the people who actually worked in the fields were living in conditions that can only be described as modern-day slavery. Reports from the Dominican Republic describe workers living in tiny shacks on sugar plantations, with no electricity, no running water, and barely enough food. Many were paid just a few dollars a day if they were paid at all. Families depended on mobile churches and charities to survive, and when workers didn't meet quotas, they risked abuse, withheld pay, and forced overtime. Even worse, children were often out in the fields working alongside adults, with no protective gear, exposed to pesticides and dangerous tools. Some of these kids weren't even there. By choice reporters documented cases of Haitian children being kidnapped or dumped on plantations to labor in the cane fields. And this wasn't a distant past. These reports came out in the early 2000s and even resurfaced as recently as 2022. Meanwhile, Domino Sugar, the jewel in the Fanjul empire, has grown bigger than ever, feeding not just America's sweet tooth, but its addiction. What unsettles me most is how quietly all of this happens. We know about Coca-Cola, we know about fast food chains, but sugar itself and the families who profit from it remain in the shadows. Billionaires in plain sight shaping our diets, our politics, and in a way our future, without most of us even knowing their names. And yet, every time we rip open a packet of sugar, we're part of that system. Chapter 9. Living in Sugar's Shadow. After everything I've uncovered, it's hard to look at something as simple as a spoonful of sugar the same way again. What seems so small, so harmless, has shaped centuries of history, driving wars, fueling slavery, rewriting science, and even controlling governments. And yet sugar is still here. It's still everywhere. Today, the average American eats over 60 pounds of added sugar every year. That's like carrying around the weight of a child made entirely of sugar and consuming it piece by piece. When I think about it that way, it stops feeling like a treat and starts feeling like a trap. The craziest part is that so much of it is hidden. Sure, we expect sugar in soda candy and desserts, but it's also tucked into bread sauces, salad dressings, even foods labeled healthy. In Ireland, a court once ruled that Subway's bread couldn't legally be called bread because it contained so much sugar, it had to be classified as cake. And here in the US, that kind of thing barely raises an eyebrow. We shrug it off. We joke about our sweet tooth. We convince ourselves that one more soda, one more snack isn't that big of a deal, but behind every bite is a billion-dollar industry that knows exactly how to keep us hooked. What unsettles me the most is how familiar the pattern feels. Addiction, exploitation, corruption. These aren't relics of sugar's past. They're woven into its present. From the rat studies showing how powerfully sugar hijacks the brain, to modern reports of forced labor in sugar fields, it feels like we've learned nothing. Or maybe we've just chosen not to. Because the truth is uncomfortable. The truth is that companies are profiting off our cravings, governments are protecting billionaires over public health, and most of us, myself included, are still reaching for that next hit of sweetness. When I step back, I realize sugar isn't just a food story, it's a human story. One about power, greed, survival, and how something so small can quietly rule our lives. I don't know if we'll ever break free from sugar's shadow. Maybe it's too deeply embedded in who we are and what we eat and how we live. But at the very least, we can start seeing it for what it really is. Not just sweetness, not just comfort, but history, dark, bitter, and still unfolding. And maybe, just maybe, that awareness is the first step toward change. So here we are, at the end of sugar's long, bitter history. From ancient medicine to the horrors of the slave trade, from political corruption to modern-day health crises, sugar has never just been about sweetness. It's been about control. And while we may not be able to escape it entirely, it's in almost everything we eat. We can choose to see it more clearly. To understand the hidden costs behind every packet, every soda, every slice of cake. Because awareness is power, and power is the one thing the sugar industry has always tried to keep for itself. Thank you for spending this time with me and for listening to a story that often gets buried under the weight of its own sweetness. If this episode made you think differently about sugar, or if it opened your eyes to something new, I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is True Crime Echoes, where we peel back the layers of history to expose the darker truths that still shape our lives today. Until next time, stay curious, ask questions, and take care of yourselves.